Hello and welcome to episode 3 of this chess blowout series where one side defeats the other in 30 moves or less. And today we have a game between one of the greatest attacking players in history, Blowout Tal, with the white pieces versus, forgive me if I mispronounce this name, Roman Dzindzichashvili, with the black pieces. And this game was played in New York in 1991. And so let's begin. Tal, also known as the Wizard of Riga, as he was able to conjure up attacks seemingly out of thin air. He plays e4, an attacking move in the opening. And so the opponent responds with c5, here the Sicilian defense, and then we have knight to f3 and knight to c6, common moves in the Sicilian opening. And now c3 is played, which would like to help d4. This pawn push by d4 will be supported by the c3 pawn. And so now we have d5. A common idea in the Sicilian defense is to try and get your d pawn to d5 to free up your position to prevent you from being cramped, which is possible for black in the Sicilian defense. So here we have a capture of this pawn and then a recapture by the queen, which is not so bad, bringing the queen out early here as c3 has been played, and so this prevents the knight from jumping to c3 and harassing this queen. And so now d5 is played, and after capture of the d5 pawn, d4 is played, and after the c5 pawn captures on d4, we have a recapture with the c pawn capturing on d4, and now white has an isolated queen pawn. And in this position, isolated queen pawns, the person with this pawn wants to avoid exchanges, as the more pieces that are exchanged off, the easier of a target this isolated pawn will become later in the endgame. And so the person attacking this isolated pawn would like to blockade the pawn, keeping pieces in front of it and controlling this square in front of the isolated pawn, and at the same time try to trade off pieces and eventually attack this isolated pawn in the endgame. And so we have e6, which helps control the square in front of the isolated pawn, and now knight to c3 attacking the queen. And so the queen retreats to d6 here. And now we have developing by Tal with bishop to d3 here. And so now we have knight to f6 by black, further developing, and castling by white. And so here developing moves continue. The bishop is developed, the rook is attacking this half open e-file, and now black castles. And so common developing moves here. We see the game evaluation is pretty much even at this point. And so now this rook moves over to help pile up on this half-open d-file and put pressure on the isolated queen pawn. And so the queen moves out of this line of fire by this build-up on the d-file. And one benefit of the isolated queen pawn for the person who has it is the open files on either side of the isolated pawn may be used by your rooks and the queen possibly. And so this isolated pawn can become a weakness in the endgame, but in the middle game it can be used for attacking purposes. And so here we have a a knight move to b4 attacking this bishop. And so the bishop moves out of the line of fire. And now we have another developing move. Bringing this bishop to d7, where we'll possibly swing over here to c6 and help cover this square in front of the isolated pawn. And so here the rook moves to d1 to help cover this isolated pawn. And the bishop has finally moved to attack down this diagonal and cover the square d5 in front of the isolated pawn. And now another feature of the isolated pawn, it can allow a knight to land on e5 or c5 here, and it will be protected by this pawn. And so here we have the bishop jumping in front of this isolated pawn and stopping it in its tracks. And after some exchanges here, we have the rook moving up to the third rank, where it can swing over to the king side and assist with an attack against black's king. And so now we have h6 attacking this bishop. So Tal retreats back, and now the final piece that was not doing anything, this rook, the queen rook, moves over from a8 to c8, where it can keep an eye on this open c file and put pressure on this bishop. And now the rook swings over to g3, where it is directly lined up against black's king, and a possible threat is capturing this h6 pawn, which then cannot be captured as this g7 pawn is pinned to the king by this rook. And so the king moves out of the line of fire, and this bishop moves back to prevent any surprises later by this rook, as the rook was threatening the bishop even though it was currently protected by the queen. Now we have the rook moving up to possibly double rooks on the c file, or even to swing this rook over to d7 to have all the heavy pieces piled up here attacking the isolated pawn. And so the queen moves over to f3, where it is directly lined up on the black king, even though pieces are in the way here. After some trades, that could be trouble for black. So the rooks double up on the c file, threatening to capture the bishop on c1, and if there's a recapture, we could have a threat here against the king, although this bishop would be able to block, it appears. And so if we look at the evaluation, right now it is slightly in black's favor, but the game is about even. And so the bishop moves off of this line here, so it is not under fire by these rooks. And then we have a6. So what does this move do? Possibly it is a waiting move to see what white intends to do next. Also, it could help push forward this b pawn to gain space on the queen side. And so now Tal launches his attack with a sacrifice of this rook, capturing the pawn on g7. And so the king recaptures. And here with this move, it shows that white has jumped ahead half a pawn. And so with the continuation, another piece is potentially sacrificed if black accepts this bishop, which it looks like he does not. And with this move, the game has jumped drastically in white's favor, and white should be winning now. So if we go back a move and look at what should have been played, it looks like black should have accepted the capture of this bishop, but even then he is behind, and white would be up in this evaluation, almost a full pawn. even though white gave up a bishop and a rook for just 2 pawns. So we see how great Tal is at attacking, just conjuring up an attack out of thin air, seemingly out of nowhere. Okay, and so the bishop was refused, but this spells even more trouble for black. And so it looks like the best follow-up is knight captures here on f7, but Tal does not do that. He moves his queen to h3, which protects the bishop and lines up on black's king. And then we have a knight move here, threatening to capture this bishop. But the final move, bishop to f8 here, and Tal's opponent has resigned after this move. And so Mikhail Tal wins this game in 26 moves. Excuse me. And we see here that it looks like there's a mate in 3 here. And so we can go ahead and play through these moves. So the best move here would be to block, just buying time. But then after a queen capture, then we have knight to h6 as the king is pretty much trapped. And then queen captures with check. The king retreats and then mate. So this was a very interesting attack, which Tal just launched on black out of nowhere, sacrificing a rook, then offering a bishop sacrifice for just 2 pawns, and Tal rips open the king side and follows up with a checkmating attack. And so a very interesting chess blowout. I hope you've enjoyed episode 3 of this chess blowout series. And if you have, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you, and have a great day.